Okay, so imagine this. You're like this brilliant Harvard scholar, rising star in the literary world.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have this like crazy intense spiritual transformation.
Yeah.
To the point where you believe you're like literally channeling the voice of God.
Wow.
You start acting all radically, telling your students to like flee to the mountains because the apocalypse is coming.
Oh, Renee.
And you end up in a mental institution
Really?
diagnosed with religious insanity.
Oh, wow.
That is the true story of Jones Very, this 19th century American poet.
Huh.
And that's what we're going to be talking about today on the Mad Genius Thesis.
Well, what's so fascinating about Very's story is that it really gets at this question.
Yeah.
You know, this big question we always deal with on the show.
Yeah.
Is there a connection between creativity and mental illness?
Right.
Was Very a visionary, touched by the divine?
Mm-hmm.
Or was this new birth, as he called it,
Right.
a sign of something darker? A break with reality.
Yeah, and that's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
Yeah.
We're not just, exploring the life of this really fascinating poet, but we're also like delving into the complexities of the human mind and this murky territory where genius and madness might actually be connected.
It's so interesting.
To help us through all this, we're looking at Clark Davis's biography, God's Scrivener, The Madness and Meaning of Jones Very.
Davis does such a great job of giving us the historical context,
Yeah.
which is so important here.
Yeah.
Very's life takes place during the Second Great Awakening,
Mm-hmm.
this period of super intense religious fervor in America.
Mm-hmm.
People were looking for signs for a deeper connection to something divine.
Right, so you have this backdrop of spiritual seeking.
Yeah.
And then you have Jones Very, this Harvard scholar,
Mm-hmm.
claiming he's basically a prophet.
I can see why.
It's no wonder people were both like captivated and totally freaked out by him.
Totally. And to really get why people reacted the way they did,
Yeah.
I think we need to look closer at his early life. Davis paints this picture of a young man shaped by both deep loss and intellectual ambition.
Mm-hmm.
Very was born in Salem, Massachusetts,
Okay.
to a sea captain father who unfortunately died of tuberculosis when Jones was only 11.
It's got to be tough on a kid.
It is,
Okay.
yeah. And then you have his mother, Lydia,
Okay.
strong-willed woman who definitely had a big impact on shaping his character.
Right.
He excelled academically,
Yeah.
ended up at Harvard,
Yeah.
but then his life takes this crazy turn when he's a senior,
Okay.
when he has this profound spiritual transformation.
So this is where the whole new birth thing comes in.
Exactly.
He suddenly thinks he's God's mouthpiece.
Right.
And there's this one poem where he describes these thoughts rushing through his mind like a viewless wind,
Oh.
forcing open the portals of his being.
Huh.
It's beautiful, but also kind of creepy, don't you think?
Yeah, it is. It's that paradox at the heart of Very's story.
Right.
His language, his poetry.
Yeah.
It's often sublime,
Yeah.
deeply moving. But his actions become so strange.
Oh, yeah.
Davis talks about how he started interrupting classes,
Oh, no.
telling his fellow students to renounce all their possessions
Whoa.
and flee to the mountains
Wow.
to prepare for the coming apocalypse.
Not exactly Professor of the Year material.
No, not really.
So this is what leads him to McLean Hospital,
Yeah.
a mental institution.
Right.
So was it like a straightforward case of mental illness, or was it like, some people say, just super intense spirituality?
Well, the doctors at the time diagnosed him with religious insanity,
Okay.
which kind of reflects how they understood mental illness back then.
Right.
But Davis wants us to think about other perspectives,
Okay.
to think critically about how we define and diagnose mental illness,
Mm-hmm.
especially in historical context.
Yeah.
He brings up Elizabeth Peabody,
Okay.
this prominent transcendentalist
Uh-huh.
who knew very well.
Yeah.
And even though she admired him,
Right.
she really doubted he was sane. She even called him as crazy as ever in her writing.
Wow. Okay, so we've got one perspective that's leaning towards mental illness.
Yeah.
What are some of the other viewpoints that Davis talks about?
Well, on the other side of the spectrum, you have Bronson Alcott,
Okay.
another leader in the Transcendentalist movement.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a very different take.
Okay.
He saw Very as insane with God.
Insane with God.
Yeah, suggesting a divine madness,
Okay.
a kind of heightened spiritual awareness
Ah.
that goes beyond our normal ideas of sanity.
This is where it gets complicated.
Yeah.
And where that whole mad genius question is so hard to figure out.
Right.
Was Very tapping into something we don't understand?
Yeah.
Or was his mind just playing tricks on him?
Yeah.
And how much did the social context, what people expected at the time influenced those perceptions.
That's a great point. And I think to understand how complicated Very's situation was, we have to consider the influence of Transcendentalism, this philosophical and literary movement that was happening all over New England at the time. Transcendentalists believed in the goodness of humanity, the importance of intuition and experience over reason and tradition, and the idea that people could have a direct experience with the divine. No middleman.
So in a way, Very's claim that he was channeling God's voice kind of fit in with what the Transcendentalists were all about.
Totally.
It's almost like he took their ideas to the extreme.
Yeah, to the most literal conclusion.
To the most literal conclusion. And this brings us to another big figure in Very's story, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Of course.
The leader of Transcendentalism.
Right.
Their relationship is a fascinating study in contrast.
Yeah.
But it's kind of ends badly.
Yeah, it does.
So Emerson was like Very's biggest supporter at first, right?
He was, yeah. He was sharing Very's poetry, introducing him to other intellectuals.
Right, but then as Very gets more and more intense, Emerson starts to back away.
Slowly backing away.
What happened?
It's like watching a friendship just fall apart in slow motion.
Oh, wow.
Because of their different personalities and philosophies. Emerson was all about intuition and self-reliance. But he also believed in reason and balance.
Right.
Very's total surrender to God, his giving up of his own will. It was just too much for Emerson.
Wow.
Even though he recognized that Very's spiritual longing was real.
Right. And we see that tension play out in a very real way.
Yeah.
When Emerson edits Very's first collection of poems, essays and poems, he includes some of Very's more out there prophetic poems. But he also picks a lot of his nature poems.
Yeah.
The ones that feel more relatable.
It's grounded.
Yeah, it's like he was trying to present a version of Very.
Yeah.
That people could handle.
Make him more palatable.
Yeah, one that wouldn't like totally freak everyone out.
Right, he was curating Very's image.
Yeah, and this raises an interesting question for us.
Yeah.
One that goes beyond just Very's case.
Okay.
What happens to art?
Yeah.
When we question the artist's mental state?
Interesting.
Does it change how we see their work?
It's a good question. And before we get into Very's poetry, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about Elizabeth Peabody.
Right.
She questioned Very's sanity.
Yeah.
But she still admired him. It seems like even those who thought he might be mentally unstable still saw that his work had a certain power and beauty.
Right. How do we reconcile those two seemingly conflicting views?
That's the real issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
Very's poetry becomes this kind of Rorschach test.
Okay.
Do you see whispers of the divine? The pure expression of a soul connected to God?
Right.
Or do you see the thoughts of a troubled mind trying to make sense of the world?
I think that's a perfect place to start looking at some of Very's poetry.
Okay, let's do it.
Which we'll do after a quick break.
That's good.
When we come back, we'll dive into some specific poems. Okay. And see if we can unlock the mystery of Jones Very's.
The mystery.
Mad genius, misunderstood mystic, or something else entirely.
Can't wait.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. Before the break, we were talking about how Jones Very's poetry can be seen as a window into his complex inner world.
Right.
A world that seemed to blend spiritual insight and mental instability.
Yeah, and that's what makes looking at his work so fascinating.
Yeah.
We're always asking ourselves, are we hearing the voice of a true mystic?
Right.
Or the ramblings of someone who's really struggling?
Right. To help us with that question,
I
thought we could maybe look at one of Very's most famous poems, The Winter Bird.
Okay.
On the surface, it's a nature poem, but like a lot of Very's work, it hints at something deeper, something more profound.
I agree. And what really strikes me about The Winter Bird is its focus on resilience.
Okay.
Finding joy and beauty even when things are really hard.
Right.
The poem starts with this stark image. A lonely tree, a naked field, a frozen rivulet, a frozen ground.
It's bleak. It's desolate.
It is. Yeah, you can practically feel the cold.
Yeah.
But then in this empty landscape, Very brings in the bird.
Okay.
But on the bough, a snowy crown, a tiny bird with song so sweet, it cheers the day and makes it fleet.
It's like this burst of color.
Yeah, exactly.
Against a black and white background.
And I think that contrast is really important for understanding what the poem is really about, the bird.
Yeah.
Even though it's small and vulnerable, it represents the spirit of resilience, this refusal to give up, even though winter is harsh.
It's almost like Very is putting his own struggle onto this little bird.
I see that.
You know, he felt isolated, misunderstood, judged by everyone.
Yeah.
But he also held on to this deep inner strength, this belief that even in the darkest times, there's still beauty and meaning to be found.
That's a really beautiful interpretation, and I think it speaks to the ambiguity that we find in so much of Very's work.
Yeah.
We can read The Winter Bird as just a poem about nature's resilience, but we can also see it as a reflection of Very's own spiritual journey.
Right.
His search for hope and comfort in a world that often felt cold and unwelcoming.
And that brings us back to the mad genius question.
It does.
Does the fact that Very struggled with mental illness mean that his insights are invalid?
Right.
That he couldn't find beauty in the midst of pain?
I don't think so. In fact, I think Very's experience with mental illness might have actually made him more sensitive to the world around him, more aware of how fragile life is and how fleeting beauty can be.
That's an interesting point.
It is, isn't it?
It's like his struggles, his so-called madness, actually made his artistic vision stronger.
And it's not just The Winter Bird that explores these themes.
Okay.
Another poem, The Hand and Foot, takes a different approach.
Okay.
Focusing on the idea of passive resistance.
That's passive resistance.
Yeah. Very argues that real strength comes from quiet, steady opposition to injustice.
That reminds me of Gandhi's idea of nonviolent resistance.
Right.
Was very influenced by that.
There's no direct evidence of that.
Okay.
But it's an interesting thought, especially considering very strong abolitionist beliefs.
Right. He was living when slavery was a huge issue in America.
Exactly.
Maybe we can see The Hand and Foot as a hidden message about resisting slavery peacefully.
It's possible that adds another layer of complexity.
It does.
To the poem and to Very's whole way of thinking.
Right. He wasn't just someone searching for spiritual truth.
Right.
He was also really involved in the social and political issues of his time.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that makes Very so relevant today.
Okay.
He reminds us that spirituality and social justice aren't separate things.
Yeah.
They can actually be deeply connected.
So we've got this brilliant but troubled poet wrestling with big questions about faith, sanity, and social justice.
Right.
He spent time in a mental institution, was friends with, then kind of scared off Ralph Waldo Emerson. Yeah, what happens to Jones? Very after McLean.
Right.
Does he calm down, find some peace?
Well, his story takes a surprising turn.
Okay.
He actually becomes a Unitarian minister.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
The same guy who told his students to run to the mountains because the world was ending is now leading a church?
Right.
How does that even happen?
It seems Very figured out a way to express his intense spirituality in a more conventional way, maybe a more structured way.
Okay.
His sermons were still spiritual.
Yeah.
But they were also more measured and focused on practical moral guidance.
So he toned down the doom and gloom a little?
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
But did he ever really let go of those core beliefs? His conviction that he was speaking for God?
That's the interesting part.
Yeah.
It seems like those core beliefs never really went away.
Okay.
But he learned to express them in a way that didn't make people freak out or get him sent back to McLean.
Or get him sent back to McLean. But some people might say he never really toned it down.
Yeah.
He just learned to express it differently.
I think there's some truth to that.
Yeah.
His writing and sermons from this later period still have that intensity, that feeling that he's wrestling with these huge spiritual truths.
Right.
But there's also a bigger emphasis on personal responsibility and ethical behavior.
So instead of just proclaiming God's word, he was trying to help people actually live those teachings.
That's a good way to put it. I'm curious, though.
Yeah.
How did people react to him as a minister? I mean, imagine going to church.
Yeah.
Knowing your minister had been diagnosed with religious insanity not that long ago. It must have been strange, as you might imagine.
Yeah.
There were mixed reactions.
Okay.
Some people were drawn to his sincerity. You know, how deeply he felt things.
Yeah.
While others were still skeptical, thinking he was still a little off.
So basically, he went from being a controversial figure at Harvard and in Transcendentalist circles to stirring things up in the more down-to-earth world of churches.
Yeah. He never had a dull moment, did he?
It seems not. And his story really challenges how we think about creativity, mental illness, and faith.
It does.
It's easy to just say he was mad.
Yeah.
But I think it's much more complicated than that.
Much more nuanced. It's like he was trying to balance his unusual spiritual experiences with a more normal role in society.
Which actually might be a theme that runs through a lot of his work.
Yeah.
This tension between what an individual experiences internally and what society expects of them.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons I think Very's work still speaks to people today.
Okay.
We're still struggling with these questions about truth, intuition, experience, and how individuals relate to society.
And how should we interpret his work? Should we read his poetry as the ramblings of someone who's mad?
Yeah.
Or the inspired words of a mystic?
That's a great question, and one that we'll keep exploring when we come back.
Sounds good.
We'll delve deeper into Jones Very's life after MacLean, and look at how he changed as a poet and a spiritual seeker.
Welcome back to the Mad Genius Thesis. We've been exploring the life and work of Jones Very, this 19th century American poet.
Right.
You know, whose intense spirituality and unconventional behavior led to that diagnosis of religious insanity.
Right.
But as we've seen, Very's story is way more complex than that label suggests.
It really is. Very's life makes us think critically about the relationship between creativity and mental illness, faith and reason, and, an individual search for meaning in a world that often seems indifferent to that.
Right. And before we left off, we were talking about Very's surprising transition.
Yeah.
From would-be prophet to Unitarian minister.
It's quite a change.
Seems like he found a way to express his intense spirituality in a more structured role.
Right.
But did his poetry change during this later part of his life?
That's a great question. And while Very never really abandoned those core themes, the search for spiritual connection, the beauty of nature, the importance of inner transformation. Yeah. There is a noticeable shift in the tone and style of his later poems.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Sure. One poem that comes to mind is The Torn Flower, which he wrote after he was released from MacLean.
Okay.
And it starts with these lines.
Yeah.
They told me love would blossom on decay and hope would live when faith had passed away.
Wow.
There's this feeling of disillusionment there, a recognition of the pain and loss that's just part of being human.
That line, they told me love would blossom on decay.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking.
It is.
But also really insightful. It's like he's admitting that there's a difference between this perfect idea of love and the reality of relationships.
Exactly. And there's a sense of longing in the poem.
Okay.
A yearning for connection that seems to go unmet. It's almost as if Very is thinking about his own experiences, his own struggles to balance his intense desire for spiritual connection with, just the demands of everyday life.
And how does this poem connect to the mad genius question we've been talking about?
Well, I think The Torn Flower suggests that creativity can come from pain and suffering.
Okay.
Very's experience with mental illness, his time at MacLean, may have helped him understand human fragility and how complex the human heart really is.
So you're saying his madness might have actually made his artistic vision richer?
I think that's a valid interpretation. And it's important to remember that madness is a label that's been used throughout history to describe people who challenge norms. People who see the world in different ways.
Right, and in Very's case, that different way of seeing the world led him to create poetry that still speaks to people today.
It did so as we wrap up this deep dive into Jones Very's life and work.
Yeah.
I think the big question is, what can we learn from his story?
Right.
I think Very's life shows us that the relationship between creativity and mental illness is messy and complicated.
Right.
There's no easy answers.
Yeah.
It's not about romanticizing mental illness or ignoring the struggles of people who experience it.
Yeah.
But it is about recognizing that genius can show up in unconventional ways.
Unconventional, even unsettling ways.
Exactly. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between inspiration and delusion.
It really is. And I think each person's case needs to be understood on its own terms.
Absolutely.
We can't just label someone as mad or genius.
Right.
And leave it at that.
There's always more to the story.
Right. And I think Very's story encourages us to be okay with ambiguity. To be okay with not having all the answers.
Right.
To ask questions to challenge what we think we know. To really dig into what it means to be human.
Well said. And as for Very's work,
Yeah.
I think more people should read it.
Okay.
Some of his language might seem old-fashioned today.
Right.
But the main themes of his poetry,
Yeah.
the search for connection, the struggle with doubt, the beauty and fragility of nature, those are themes that are timeless and universal.
Yeah, so if you're intrigued by this deep dive into Jones Very's life and work, we encourage you to check out his writing for yourself.
You might be surprised by what you find.
You might be. And remember,
Yeah.
It's okay to be challenged to question.
Uh-huh.
To wrestle with those things we don't fully understand.
That's often where real understanding begins.
Thanks for joining us on the Mad Genius Thesis. We'll be back next week with another fascinating look at the connections between creativity and the mind. Until then, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.